Hi, and welcome to today's workshop. My name is Geeta Harris-Newton. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer and VP of Legal at Quantcast. Today we're going to talk about consumer privacy in the ad ecosystem. So privacy is a hot topic. Privacy legislation is here. What are the implications for brands, for publishers and agencies in this new environment, and how do we continue to operate in a privacy-focused data economy? Later, I'll be joined on stage by Brian Lee, the Director of Engineering at BuzzFeed, for a little bit of Q&A on BuzzFeed's approach to privacy compliance. And then if we have time, we'll also take questions from the audience, and you can also submit questions online on Slido. So let's dig in. The media ecosystem relies on data. We need data to help us sell more stuff. That stuff might be inventory for publishers, units for brands, and we know that that data helps us find the right audience and monetize or sell stuff more effectively. Consumer data is the resource that brands, agencies, and publishers have been leveraging to drive sales for a long time. For brands, consumers are open to new products and brands, but you have to find your audience and deliver personalization and relevance, and that requires good sources of data. For content that we enjoy, blogs, newspapers, they're kept alive by the content creators and the publishers' ability to monetize that content. Digital media is kept alive by that value proposition between publishers and their audience. Ad-supported content is what keeps the internet free. And at the same time that we're recognizing the power of data and the power of insights about our audiences that we get from data, we see increased scrutiny around using consumer data. Consumers have a right to privacy. We're hearing more and more about consumers' right to privacy, and we're increasingly reading about it in the news and seeing new laws protecting this right to privacy. The right to privacy is a good thing. In fact, it's a great thing. We're all consumers and we can all benefit from it. And in our roles as brands, as agencies, as publishers, as ad tech, we have a responsibility to protect our audience's privacy. And we can do that by thoroughly and thoughtfully approaching data collection and data management, and doing so in a way that protects our audience's right to privacy while still allowing us to use data to provide better experiences for consumers, to help consumers find the content that they're interested in. But what data do we need? As an industry, we've been collecting consumer data for a long time, but in many cases we've done so without a clear strategy or thorough consideration. So stop and ask yourself, what data do you need and why? Collecting data that you don't have an immediate use for in the hopes that it one day might be valuable down the road is becoming increasingly risky. Why is it risky? Well, look at the news. We're inundated with headlines about data breaches, about brands that we trust or we thought we trusted, doing things with our data that makes us lose that trust. But you don't have to be one of those headlines. You need to ask yourself not just what data you're collecting and why, or for what purposes, but also how are you managing that data and how are your partners managing that data? So as we're going to talk about, collection and use of consumer data is becoming a space that's highly regulated. And what do I mean by that? There are more and more rules that apply. We hear about GDPR in the EU, and we see big companies like Facebook and Google testifying before Congress and actually calling for privacy legislation to be introduced. We see states in the US like California adopting privacy laws. So you can take some actions now to make sure that you're complying with new rules about data, that you're ready for those laws, and that you're in a position to really be a trusted brand and a trusted partner when it comes to data. That's a really positive and empowering thing, and it's something that you can do. But let's be clear, it's not business as usual. Business as usual isn't an option. The old mindset of ignoring your data hygiene isn't going to work in a privacy-focused world. Everyone in the ecosystem should be paying attention now to privacy legislation and building a strategy to future-proof your business. Transparency. We hear that buzzword of transparency for audiences. Consumers want transparency. Regulators are requiring transparency. But what is transparency around consumer data, and how can you provide it? Transparency is about unambiguous information. So when it comes to consumer data and privacy, you can provide transparency by providing consumers with a clear, unambiguous understanding about what data you're going to collect about them, how you're going to collect it, and why, for what purposes, as well as with whom you're going to share it. It's not just those wordy privacy policies that cover your legal requirements, but increasingly we're seeing that more is needed. Consumers want transparency, and regulators are increasingly telling us that we need to give it to them. But we've seen that consumers are really in the dark. According to Harvard Business Review, only about 25% of people understand that their location is being collected as part of their data trail online. Only 14% understand that their web surfing history is shared. But 97% were concerned about data misuse. So they don't understand, they don't have that transparency into what data is being collected about them, but they're concerned about it. And we've seen legislation to try and step in and help require that transparency. And so we're seeing this increased privacy legislation. And that privacy legislation isn't about the technology that we use. The privacy legislation is really around consumers' right to understand. So let's look at the example of GDPR, right? GDPR has dominated the conversations for the first half of this year for sure. GDPR regulates personal data in the EU, and that includes under GDPR things like cookie IDs, things like device identifiers, IDFA, IP addresses, and other online identifiers. This is the type of data that we use in digital advertising. And although GDPR is an EU regulation, it absolutely has global impacts. Why global? Well, we're a global economy, right? So we see brands with global reach, agencies with global reach, publishers with global reach. It's very likely that you have customers who are in the EU, that you serve advertisements to someone in the EU, that you have EU residents visiting your site, or that you work with partners who do, or partners who may collect EU data. But even more than that, we all see in our businesses this need for a unified global approach, right? So we find efficiencies in our business when we set one policy, across our tech stack and apply it globally. And what does that mean? Really, in effect, what that means is that we look to the lowest common denominator, or in other words, we end up putting global policies in place that comply with the most strict privacy requirements that we see across the globe. What is GDPR's impacts? So GDPR has impacted all players within the ad ecosystem. So a few things to look at. One, more responsibility. So under GDPR, you have to take more responsibility for your data practices and those of your partners. Publishers are on the front lines because they have that direct interface with consumers, but so do brands. You own the relationship with your audience, and your brand is at stake. Another impact is transparency. So we've talked about these requirements to give transparency to the consumers, but one of the impacts of GDPR is that brands, agencies, publishers, you're seeing this transparency for yourself as well. So as you work to understand the data that you use and that your partners use, you gain transparency into those practices of your partners, as well as the requirement to give consumers choice and control over the data about them. So that's an impact, that you're having to give that choice and control to consumers. But again, that's also a benefit to you as a brand, because with the greater visibility into your supply chain that you get through GDPR, you can also exercise more controls about your partners and what your partners are doing. And then finally, really there's an opportunity here, an opportunity to build trust. So what we've seen is that brands can step up and build this trust with their audience. Agencies can step up and build this trust and become a trusted partner with the brands that they work with. Let's look at advertiser impact more specifically and how GDPR applies. And this slide, although I'm talking about advertisers, is really applicable to publishers and agencies as well. So first and most importantly, know that GDPR is having an impact on advertisers. Most of the cookie-based data collection that the advertising industry engages in will require consent. The existing e-privacy directive in the EU plus GDPR means that robust, unambiguous consent is required to set cookies. There are uses for data which you may rely on legitimate interests, but you'll need consent to set a cookie if you're going to use that data for advertising purposes. And it's not just ad tech that needs consent. If you're a brand or an agency and you're collecting that data from your site for advertising purposes, you'll need consent as well. So the ability to target digitally, we're seeing impacted by GDPR, as well as leveraging third-party vendors. So to the extent that you have a viewability vendor or an ad server, a SSP, a DSP, a DMP, those partners likely need to use cookies, likely collect data to help empower your brand. And so we're seeing impacts to those businesses as well as they need to provide this transparency and this choice. And underlying all of this really is this fundamental need for transparency that I keep talking about, which is really a new thing for us in the ad ecosystem. It's not something that we've really had to provide a lot of in the past, but it's what we're seeing we need to do now. Let's talk about a few common advertiser misconceptions. So the first one here, we don't need to worry about cookie consent on our site. Well, we just talked about that a little bit, right? Even if you're a brand, if you're a website operator, it is something that you have to worry about, because in order to use cookies on your site to collect and use information for digital advertising, you are going to need consent under GDPR. And it's not just you, but remember, even if you don't need that consent, your partners are going to need it. Second misconception, it's only a publisher matter. They're the ones serving ads. Well, as we've just talked about, that's not true. You as a brand are a website operator as well. And you as a brand are going to need to make sure that your partners are complying with GDPR as well, because under GDPR, it's your responsibility as well. The third piece here, our advertising strategies won't be impacted. There's no need for action. That's not true. We actually are seeing an impact to advertisers and to their strategies. So again, for the reasons we've talked about, these are misconceptions that we continue to hear from brands, but really that aren't true. What else? We've talked about our need for data to optimize our advertising, to reach our audience and know our audience. We've talked about the benefit to your brand of building consumer trust through transparency to consumers and to partners about your use of data and the legal requirements for transparency in the EU with the implementation of GDPR earlier this year and the global impacts of GDPR. But it's not just GDPR. These demands for consumer transparency, control, and choice around data are in fact global. So we have GDPR. We also have the current e-privacy directive in the EU. That's the cookie law that together with GDPR requires consent to set cookies. What we're going to have soon in Europe is the e-privacy regulation. The e-privacy regulation is still in draft form. It was expected to be adopted with an implementation date earlier this year to coincide with GDPR. It's been delayed. And so we expect that it won't actually take effect until the year 2020, so we have a little bit of time. But what we do know is that it's being worked on and that we can expect it to create even more stringent rules in the marketplace for using cookies, using IDFAs, accessing information from the device of a consumer and requiring consent for that. But it's not just Europe. We see other countries throughout the world looking at GDPR as a model for privacy legislation. In the US, in California, we've seen the California Consumer Privacy Act that was enacted earlier this year. That act takes effect in 2020. And that act, if you do business in the US, you're going to be impacted by it. Why is that? Even if you're not a California company, you likely have some customers in California. You likely serve advertisements to residents of California or have people from California who buy your products or visit your website. This California Consumer Privacy Act has been referred to as GDPR Light. So it's not exactly GDPR, but it has a lot of the same characteristics, and it really requires the same transparency around consumer data that we've seen from GDPR. So requirements around explaining to your audience what information you collect, what information your partners collect, how you use it, why you use it, what you do with it. Requirements for giving users the ability to opt out of your use of that data. So that piece is a little bit different from GDPR. There aren't quite the opt-in consent requirements, but there's this requirement to allow consumers to opt out. But there are also requirements around things like data access. So allowing consumers to access the data you have about them, to tell you that some of that data is wrong and have you correct it, to ask you to delete that data and in fact forget the consumer. There are also requirements in the new California law about data breach. So under the new law, there's actually an ability for individuals to sue you directly, either themselves or as part of a class action, if you have a data breach. And in fact, under the law, they're allowed to damages even if they can't prove that that data breach caused them any harm. So in California, we expect this Consumer Privacy Act enforcement date to be around the middle of 2020. We're still expecting that we might see additional amendments from the California legislature, and we're expecting the California Attorney General to undertake a rulemaking proceeding so that the Attorney General will issue rules that will help us understand exactly how to implement and interpret the law. That's California, but in addition to California, we're looking potentially at US federal comprehensive privacy legislation. So I know you've all seen repeatedly these congressional testimonies being reported on, where there are hearings in Congress. You see Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, AT&T, many big players in the US in technology and in ad technology testifying before Congress, who has a lot of questions about these consumer privacy issues. And you see these large companies actually telling Congress people that we need comprehensive privacy legislation in the US. And increasingly, as I said, everyone's looking to GDPR as a model. So we don't know exactly when that federal privacy legislation will come, but we do expect to see it soon. So what can you do to get ready? Well, privacy by design. The concept of privacy by design isn't new. The idea is to think holistically about how to provide transparency to your audience about the data that you have about them and how to give them choice and control over that data. So the idea is that you would design privacy into everything you do, beginning at the idea stage. So the question for you is, where do you start? Here's the practical piece, the real nuts and bolts, the thing that you can do when you get back to your office this afternoon or tomorrow. That number one thing is to create a data map. And what do I mean by that? That means you need to make sure that you understand your data. What data you have, what you use it for, who you share it with, who your partners are. The first key to compliance is for you to understand your data, so that you can understand how to provide transparency about that data to your audience. You can't provide transparency if you don't understand that data yourself. So once you understand your data, once you have that clear picture through your data map, that will help you understand how to tackle transparency and make it easier for you to create a roadmap. So what do I mean by a roadmap? That means taking your data map and asking yourself, how can we be more transparent with our audiences? Are we giving choice and control to our audience, or how can we do that? And are our partners compliant? Who are our partners? And what contracts do we need to update to make sure that our partners are complying with all of these new rules around consumer privacy? There is some good news. There is an industry standard. So a great example of where industry has come together and created a solution around providing transparency, consent, and choice to audiences is IB Europe's transparency and consent framework. So how did we solve this for GDPR? IB Europe brought together a cross-functional group from around the industry, publishers, ad tech companies, agencies, advertisers, and developed a framework, a protocol for how we can work together to solve this issue. So key characteristics of IAB Europe's transparency and consent framework is that it's a common industry standard. It's a single standard allowing you to integrate once. It makes it easy. We speak a common language to each other using this framework around our partnerships in the industry, and it gives you efficiency. So it's one way of doing things to provide transparency between your partners and with consumers. Second key characteristic is that there's neutral governance. So IAB Europe is this neutral entity overseeing this protocol, which is very, very crucial, because instead of having one large dominant industry player that sets their own rules and can change those rules at any time without consultation with anyone, that's not what this standard is. It's an industry standard where everyone has an equal seat at the table. Third characteristic is that it's open source code, so a low level of technical debt. For brands and publishers, it's easy to install the framework on your site, making it easy even for small sites to participate. So the transparency and consent framework we're seeing really increased adoption. So there have been over 150 CMPs that have adopted the framework. CMPs are consent management providers. These are entities that provide tools for those interfaces on websites and the ability for the different players in the ecosystem to communicate with each other about transparency that's been provided to consumers and allowing those consumers to make choices around consent. Some of these CMPs are, private, where companies have built them for themselves. Other are available. Quantcast has Quantcast Choice, which is our CMP, which we make available free to publishers and advertisers who want to use it. We've also seen about 400 vendors join the framework. Now, those vendors are companies, could be ad tech companies, could be agencies, could be brands that are collecting consumer data, and they're using this framework as a way to provide that transparency as part of this industry standard. What we've seen at Quantcast is that the IAB Europe Transparency Consent Framework really works. So for us, on average, we're seeing through Quantcast Choice, our CMP product, that when we show that modal to consumers to provide them with that transparency and give them a choice, we're seeing over 95% of customers grant consent when they see those consent screens. So very effective. Having this industry protocol is a really great way to help you get ahead of the shifting legislative environment and implement privacy by design principles. So if you're listening to all this and you're still wondering, why me? Why do you need to be concerned about your data, about consumer privacy, about transparency in your data practices? Now's your chance to get ahead of the game so that you can continue to leverage valuable data-driven insights without risking your revenue by being unprepared as these new privacy laws start to impact the market. For marketers, this is an excellent opportunity for you to take a seat at the table and build trust with your audience. For agencies, this is a great opportunity for you to add strategic value. With GDPR, we saw some agencies step up, learn about the privacy impacts, and play a strategic role with their partners of being this trusted partner and guiding their brands through the process. Agencies, you have that opportunity here. And then publishers, you can gain a competitive edge. So publishers where you have a safe source of inventory for brands, that's a great place to be, and a relationship that you can build as really that trusted partner where you can even see the value of your inventory increase because of that reliability. So with that, I'd like to turn a little bit to take a look at how one publisher has implemented privacy by design and has responded to GDPR and some of these privacy impacts on the industry. So I'd like to invite up Brian Lee. Brian's the Director of Engineering at BuzzFeed. And so let's sit down and talk. So we'll have a little bit of Q&A, but we'd also love to take some questions from the audience. So go ahead and submit things in Slido, or once we've had a chance to do a little bit of talking, we'll also pass around a microphone. So Brian, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your role at BuzzFeed?
Yeah, my role at BuzzFeed is really around advertising and monetization of our different platforms and destinations. So everything around our native advertising, everything around the optimization of our ads and the distribution of our ads. Privacy and GDPR kind of came on as a tag along, and now I'm part of a committee that's focused on how we can stay compliant with the new regulations that are coming in and stay ahead of the curve.
Great. So at BuzzFeed, you see about 3 out of every 5 millennials per month. So you have a relatively young audience. What have you seen with what that audience expects with respect to privacy? How has that impacted you and your business?
Yeah, totally. I think that just because of like our audience is a little bit more tech savvy and kind of grew up with the internet, I think what our audience is looking for is a lot of what you've been saying, and is transparency and really understanding clearly how we're using our data and responding with it with over a 98% consent rate on our traffic. So yeah, so far it's been good.
Yeah. So how has privacy legislation, GDPR in the EU, but also seeing the new California privacy legislation and what else is coming down the road, how's that affected the way that you're thinking about your products and making business decisions around those products?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's easy and it's easy for people to be like, hey, this is like a tech problem and they need to solve for this, and it's going to kind of just wave a wand and everything is going to be compliant with the regulations. But I think that it's really like a team effort. We have a committee right now that we have people on product, we have people from engineering, we have people from legal, and as well as business kind of working together to kind of work through all these problems and solve it from a global perspective and less so of a specific country or a specific state basis. So we think that this is going to be more and more of like a common thing.
Right. And so with that, what are the top concerns that you're hearing around privacy regulations? And do you think that an industry-wide solution around those problems is something helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's awesome that we have something like the IAB framework, right, where we can kind of all band together, kind of sort of like the ads.text, right, where everyone agrees that this is an important thing and that everyone agrees that there's a specific way that the different vendors can kind of hop on board as well, instead of being like 5 different solutions where different vendors and different publishers will need to kind of make tech for that. Instead of doing that, we have a single solution where everyone can be a part of it, and with Quantcast CMP, we were able to easily implement a consent management platform on our sites.
That's great. So you were an early adopter of Quantcast Choice, which is our CMP on the IAB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework. Tell me what challenges you faced with implementing a CMP and kind of bringing this to your audience and your brand.
Totally. I mean, I think there's this idea of like a perfect solution that works everywhere, but in reality, that's really not the case. We have platforms everywhere. We have content that lives on other social media platforms. We have several apps. We have several sites, and we're a global company, right? So this in general has been easier because we have a solution like Quantcast Choice, but it isn't a one-size-fits-all. So we have a separate solution for AMP, a separate solution for our app, and hopefully one day we can all kind of agree on a single solution where everyone kind of can come together and people can provide consent in a single place.
So when you were implementing these solutions, what were the features that were really must-have for you at BuzzFeed?
Yeah, I think one of the must-haves was a solution where we can implement it and it will be relevant for all EU countries. I think one of the toughest parts was that we would have solutions and it would be very English focused. But as you know, our audience is global. We have French readers, we have Spanish readers, we have German readers and UK readers. So having a solution where we can implement it and it will apply to all these different countries, as well as having language that we agreed with and our legal team agreed with, and our ability to change it when we needed to was really important.
So you said that you're seeing good results with your adoption of a CMP. You said that your average consent rate is about 98%. That's really fantastic. Tell me what, the IAB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework is definitely evolving. Privacy legislation as it comes into place in different parts of the world is evolving, and the way that your audience is looking at privacy is probably evolving. So what do you see as next steps, and what are you excited about in the evolution of Quantcast Choice, of the industry standard, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I'm most excited about just having a single way of viewing privacy and how we can. We're not even like changing our tech to be like this is EU data and this is Brazil data and this is US data. So we're very much approaching it from a global perspective. And as May 25th came and went, it wasn't like, hey, we're done with this now. It's a continual process that you have to kind of preach and you have to make sure that it's not just a single person who understands the impact of some of these regulations, but you need to make sure that whatever you're learning and whatever you're implementing as you see these new regulations come in, that all the relevant stakeholders understand it and are thinking about it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and goes to what I talked about a little while ago, which is that even though there's one specific regulation in Europe, there's another one for California, et cetera, what we certainly see at Quantcast and what we see with our partners is exactly what you just said, which is it really is a global impact, right? You can't build differently, for each market. It just doesn't create efficiencies for your company. So that need to really look at it holistically, I think, is really important as brands, agencies, publishers think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for BuzzFeed, when you sort of first started to think about, okay, we need to think about privacy for our audience in a new way. We need to think about providing this transparency. What did you do first? Like, how did you tackle the problem? It seems like a really big problem. What were the first steps that you looked to?
I know, and I think that you actually pointed that out. The first thing we did was create a data map of how we're using different data, right? I mean, it's easy to think about it from an advertising perspective, but we're using data in all different parts of our website, right? So we have our internal data. How does that data flow? What type of information are we collecting? Where is the data flowing, right? Are we sending it to a third party? Do we have contracts with this third party? Do we have to sign a new data protection agreement or something like that? So, I mean, it was like a long process, but it was a healthy process since now we have an accurate and up-to-date map of exactly what type of data we're collecting and where we're sending it. So we're more confident when we're like, hey, we're sure that we're not sending any kind of compromised data or any kind of personal data without consent. So both internally and externally.
Right,
so.
right. I mean, I think that, as we talked about, that transparency within your own organization is really important, because until you do the work to really develop that map of your data, there's no way that you can tell your audience what you're doing with their data or tell your partners what you're doing with their data. And what we see with privacy regulations is that there's a requirement that you do tell your audience what you're doing, that you do provide that transparency. And if you're not sure of it yourself, you really can't make those promises to your audience. And so if you're then giving your audience the wrong information, that's a place where you really can get into trouble from a privacy perspective. And then you start to think about those really big fines that you see under GDPR, 4% of global turnover, for example. So that's great to hear that you started by looking at your data. I'd really be interested to hear, you mentioned that it was really multiple stakeholders, right? That across your business, kind of a new way of thinking about data and thinking about these issues. Can you talk a little bit more about how it is that you brought that together at BuzzFeed to really effectively figure out this data map?
For sure. I mean, I think it's really hard to kind of keep it broad and be like, hey, everyone has to care about this now, right? And it kind of, everyone kind of goes like, oh, this person knows better than me, and it kind of goes down that way. But what we did was assign people as privacy champions and give someone real accountability around letting their own stakeholders know how we're using our data, or being that last gatekeeper of approving a certain deal that a seller might have said we're going to share personal data or something like that. So yeah, they've been really good at keeping up to date of who vendors that we're working with in the EU as well as globally, and they've been a really good stakeholder in making sure that not only does tech and product think about data and think about privacy, but also on the business side too.
That's interesting, because I feel like at Quantcast we had a really similar approach. So, just as you talked about that data map and understanding your data, we did the same thing, and we pulled together really a large cross-functional team of stakeholders to come together and figure those issues out and try to work through them. But we also then created privacy champions within the organization, and we have those in different parts of the organization. So in engineering, but also, you know, in sales, in business development, in other parts of the organization. So for me, being, you know, the chief privacy officer, it can't just be me, you know, sort of telling the company that we need to think about data. It really has to be this collective thing that we're all doing. So, you know, we pulled together this cross-functional group and really had this cross-functional team for quite some time, working together very closely to figure out our data practices, to develop policies, procedures, et cetera. Now we're at a point where we've done a really great job of that, and we can step back a little bit, but not very much. So sort of as you said, it's going forward, we need to continue to think about it. We need to continue to have those privacy champions. One of the things that we did at Quantcast was that we created a new role that we hadn't had before, which is a product manager who owns privacy for the product team. So this person, that doesn't mean that privacy, we don't have other privacy champions within the product organization and other people looking at privacy within the product organization, but we actually have one person who really has this remit of focusing on privacy issues and looking across all our products and seeing, you know, here and there's a privacy implication here, or we need to think about it here, and making sure that that person really routinely brings together those stakeholders across the company to have those conversations. Because, you know, we're not stagnant in our use of data. We're not stagnant in our collection of data, and the legislation isn't stagnant. So we need to constantly be thinking about what we're doing, what's changing, how do we improve, and how do we stay on top of not just the laws, but of building that trust with our audience. So I'm curious to hear then from BuzzFeed, you know, how this has impacted you. Have you thought about it in the same ways? Have you created any of these sort of new roles, or what have you done to make sure that going forward, you're continuing to react?
Yeah, I mean, we meet as a committee on a regular basis to talk about all this stuff, but also there's new products that go on all the time, right? And new destinations that we're launching all the time. So the data map that we made in May might not be applicable today. So it's really important that we're always looking at that and always making sure that that's up to date and ensuring that any new decisions that we're making, it doesn't contradict our past decisions. So
yeah, that
it's
makes
been very
sense.
helpful.
So what recommendations do you have to publishers, to brands who are now looking at this and realizing, okay, we really need to take an active role in this, providing this transparency to our audiences? What sort of practical recommendations do you have? Yeah,
the first thing is that it's not like a Y2K where it's just going to disappear. I think it's going to become more and more relevant every day. So I think practically, I think the first thing for people to do is really get this accurate data map. I think it's really important for everyone to know exactly where their data is going and how other people are using it. And then separately, it's really just a continual look at how you're using that data and whether that has shifted or not. If you're collecting newsletters and people's emails through that, are you using that later down the line for advertising purposes? That needs to be rethought about and things like that.
So I'm looking at the questions from Slido, and one of the questions touches on what you just mentioned, which is who at your company owns the data map, and is it a challenge to keep it up to date?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely a living document, so it's not the easiest, but as long as there's a process around it, I think it's something that is manageable, right? It's not something where you're going to need to be thinking about it every single day, but if it's something where you think about it once a quarter, twice a quarter, and you kind of go back to it, I think it becomes a lot more manageable, especially as more and more people have accountability as privacy champions.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question on Slido for you, Brian. How did you go about selecting the IAB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework, and did you vet other options?
Yeah, I mean, I think the IAB consent framework was the closest to being fully GDPR compliant by May 25th. I think there's a lot of things in the regulation that makes it a little bit tough to kind of decipher how to delete people's requests for their information or proving that they provided consent because there isn't any kind of unique identifier because of this whole privacy regulation. But selecting the IAB framework was really around like where do we think the entire industry is going to go, right? I think a lot of the industry is aligning towards the IAB framework. at first Google was notorious for not being part of this, but I know they're having active conversations with them to be part of this. So it seems like this is a trend that's going to become more of a standard as we move forward, and hopefully as this becomes a global policy, it becomes even more relevant.
Yeah, and I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, we've definitely seen an increase in participants in the framework. So not just more vendors joining the framework, but we're seeing it deployed on more domains across the internet. So, tens of thousands of domains across the internet. And we're seeing really more and more as we see those bid requests coming in from exchanges, we're seeing more and more of them, the majority of them that actually do have that IAB Europe consent string to allow that communication of consent status and of transparency across the ecosystem. And I think when we talk about other options, the question asked about other options, I think that for me, one of the things I look at is having an industry standard where most in the industry have come together under it really gives you some protection, right? And that's one of the things that we considered is if you're out on your own doing your own thing, number one, there's a lot of resource that goes into developing your own thing, right? But number two is then, are you a target? Because most of the industry is here and you're over here or over here, you're a lot more visible in that space. So again, with that, I feel like the industry framework has really been a very positive development for
Totally,
us.
and as regulation is changing like on a constant basis, I think it's always good to feel confident in something like the IAB framework, where it's not just a single participant that's thinking about it and kind of trying to get ahead of the regulation, whether the framework can support certain changes or not. I think it's good to see it as an open source and multiple people contributing to the project and seeing how it evolves.
Yeah. Okay, another question from Slido. Have you seen any revenue impact as a result of GDPR?
Yeah, I think most of the revenue impact has been around programmatic, specifically right when the regulation hit. But as we've adopted the CMP and as we've seen pretty high consent rates, we've seen a lot of our programmatic revenue level off. And it's also a jumping off point of when talking to advertisers and agencies, really saying that we have a safe space for brands to actually use their data and where we are positive that people have opted in to consent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the things that we saw early was where there were publishers that had implemented the IAB Europe framework and had this very clear safe space for brands, we saw the value of that inventory increasing in the ecosystem. Okay, let's take another question from Slido. I'm hearing a ton around publishers. Oh, I lost the question. I'm hearing a ton around publishers leaning on legitimate interest. What is your opinion on this, and is this the current simple undoing of GDPR? So maybe I'll take that first, and then you can add your thoughts. So there is a place for legitimate interest, right? GDPR says that you have to have a legal basis for processing personal data, so the data of your audience, of consumers. There are 6 different legal bases that one can rely on. And for the advertising ecosystem, there are really 2 that generally apply. One is consent. You can ask your audience for consent and then use their data with their consent. Or 2, you can rely on your legitimate interest. And what that means is that you, as a company, have a legitimate interest in your business practices, right, in providing your content, in reaching your audiences. That is a legitimate interest, and that has to be balanced against the consumer's fundamental right to privacy. So this legitimate interest is really a balancing test, and it's actually not the same analysis for every company. For every company, for every brand, it's going to be different, right, because there are different factors that go into it, including what is your level of transparency? How much choice are you providing? And that goes into this balancing test. So there is a place for legitimate interests. I'll say at Quantcast, we certainly do rely on legitimate interests for some of the work that we do. But along with GDPR in the EU, there is also the e-privacy directive. So the e-privacy directive is a directive that's been around for a while. It's the cookie consent law. It's the reason that you've seen for many years in the EU sites with cookie pop-up notices letting you know that that site uses cookies for advertising and other purposes. Now, the difference with GDPR is that GDPR sits on top of that e-privacy directive, and it changes that definition of consent. It changes what is required for consent. So it's no longer enough to simply put up one of those little banners that doesn't really provide any information to the consumer. Under GDPR, it has to be unambiguous consent that you're collecting. It has to be informed, freely given, specific. There has to be an action taken by the consumer to indicate that choice to consent. So there really is this difference. And so when we hear in the industry, oh, I'm just going to rely on legitimate interests, that's okay in some instances, but when it comes to setting cookies for the purposes of digital advertising, consent is required under the law. So as a brand, if the only cookies that you're using are for your shopping cart or to facilitate the experience that the user has asked you to help them with, maybe you don't need consent. But I suspect that you have partners who are required to get consent to set the cookies that they use to help empower you and reach your audiences. So if you want to do retargeting off-site, if you want to be able to track your audiences when they leave your site, your partners are going to need to set those cookies, and that consent will be required.
For sure. And I guess like from our perspective specifically, I think there's a lot of different ways that we use data. And in the perspective of legitimate interest, it's really around, is our site usable, right? Does it provide value for our users? Can they take their quizzes and actually see their results or something like that? Around advertising, though, it's definitely an opt-in and a requirement for people to actually provide consent for us to use their data.
Yeah. So let's take another question from Slido. And if anyone actually has questions in the audience that haven't been submitted on Slido, just raise your hand and someone will bring around a microphone so you can ask your question. There's a question about high consent rates. It says, can you specify high consent rates in terms of numbers? So maybe I'll take that, which is, so again, at QuantCast, we offer QuantCast Choice, which is a CMP under the IB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework. What we're seeing in terms of numbers across all of the websites, the domains that use our CMP QuantCast Choice product, we're seeing consent rates above 95%. That means that when consumers interact with that consent modal, the vast, vast, vast majority, over 95% of them, are saying yes and giving consent. Do you want to talk about BuzzFeed's consent rates also?
BuzzFeed specifically, we're seeing 98% of our traffic with opt-in consent rates. So, I mean, I think that's really fantastic to see that, and I think that's a testament to how transparent our CMP is.
Absolutely, and I think, before GDPR came into effect, there was a lot of concern in the industry. Oh my gosh, if we ask for consent, no one's going to give it to us. But I think what we're really seeing is that is not the case, that most consumers understand that value proposition, that need to consent to cookies in order to obtain that free content. And so we're seeing them say yes. I think we had a question over here in the audience.
Hi, it's actually really.
And this is the last question.
Do you see a difference though between different regions? So I actually am a marketer who markets globally, like in the US, say, versus with Europe. Is any one of those particular audiences more likely to give consent versus the other? So in Europe, where it's a little bit more strangled.
Yeah, I would say that we're not seeing that specifically at QuantCast, and I'll let you speak to it too, Brian. Our consent numbers are pretty consistent globally, but I will say that most of the traffic that is using QuantCast Choice or CMP is EU traffic. So in many more cases, we're not asking yet for that explicit consent from consumers in other markets.
Yeah, just to echo you, it's the same for us, and our CMP is really an EU-focused implementation for now. But yeah, I can see going forward similar consent rates across countries. But yeah, we don't know until we try it.
Yeah. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to Brian Lee, Director of Engineering at BuzzFeed, and thank you all for being here.